There it is, my lords, right behind those trees, just as I said. Mind you, we should avoid getting closer. The one we visited before was relatively close to the city, so our patrols can visit it every now and then and kick out any squatters, but this one is a bit too far away to make a trip safely, and my men have just told me that they saw some movement down there. Best to keep our distance for now, at least until your lordships figure out how you want to approach this situation. Will do. But I have to say, this is quite an astonishing discovery for me to see second one of those ruptures so close to each other, without even mentioning that they seem to be completely undrained. Tell me, Captain, are there more places like this one around here? That's the same, my lord. But I think yes, there are. I received some reports from long-distance outriders over the past few years that described areas similar to this one, albeit different in color sometimes, like red or green or yellow. Amazing. That would explain so much about this area. Still, I have to thank you for now, Captain. You should return to your men, then get back to the rest of the formation and tell them to take up positions around here, just in case. But make sure they know they are to wait for our signal before moving in, understood? Great. Meanwhile, Your Highness, you and I should investigate. That rock over there should provide us with a good view, and it should keep us hidden as well. Take your spyglass and your gun, but leave the horse behind. Already prepared, Mr. Storm. We can go. I have to say, though, it's always odd to see you tense up in situations like these. It's like you're a completely different, very stiff man. Even more so than usual, that is. Spent too much time in the army, Your Highness. It comes naturally after a while, at least to most people. Those who keep cracking jokes and don't pay attention to their surroundings usually don't live long enough to learn it. Point taken. Still, how bad can it be? We have few hundred armed men behind us. Surely we can deal with a bunch of bandits or refugees. Hell, we may even not be forced to do anything. Whoever's down there will probably run away the moment they realize there's an army bearing down on them. I would not be so sure, Your Highness. If the captain of the local scout is concerned, then we should be too. Besides, I would not expect regular people to camp around in an area like this. Remember, the last one we visited on the way here was in a safe, regularly patrolled area, and yet there were no farms or homes for at least several kilometers around it. And if it is what I think it is, then I have a pretty good idea why. Ah yes, and could you actually explain to me what are we even looking at here? Last time you just started muttering to yourself and I really started to fear that this weird rupture thing had some dangerous effect on your mind. It certainly does have an effect on my mind, but not a bad one. Here, this should be a good spot. Let's crawl in a bit closer and get that spyglass out. Now, tell me what you see. A big hole in the ground? Blue light is coming out of it and there are some floating rocks above it. Must be something magical, but I never saw anything like it back home. Because those we had back home on the old continent were used up and dried out ages ago. What you see here, Your Highness, is a powerful source of energy that emanates directly from the center of our world, at least according to current theories on the matter. There used to be dozens of them around the old continent, and thousands more in the Empire to the north. Great sorcerers of old used them to fuel their powerful spells ages ago, but as they painfully learned, this power was not unlimited. Most of these sources dried up even before the Great Awakening, and the rest were used in wars that followed it, rendering great sorcerers almost useless. If they knew that there was more of them on these islands, then our history would probably have looked very differently. Still, right now, trained specialists like me can use magic to some limited extent, but our abilities are a mere trifle when compared to great spells of old. I remember reading something about it back home. So, you saying that this spring could be used to cast spells like the one Emerald Elves used to destroy Gallian capital after the Awakening? Yes and no. It could be possible, but it's been ages since anyone practiced magic of that kind, and there are no instructions on how to replicate spells on such a massive scale. But a source like this could still be used in myriad other ways. It's energy after all, and energy can be used in every aspect of our lives. It could power windmills, mines, factories. See those floating rocks? If I had access to equipment in my laboratory back home, I could probably turn them into small, portable sources of energy that could be used all across the colonies. It could be the solution to Muzaka's financial problems. And it could help me get more funds to get more forces and ships, so I can sail back home and cut off Ishizawa's treacherous head. But I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. As the captain said, there's movement down there, and it's goblins. Of course it's bloody goblins. We should probably chase them away before they stick their flag in the ground and bring more of their trade companies here. There are also dozens of those weird glowing things floating around, but I have no idea what they are. Let me see. Well, the good news is that these goblins don't seem to be associated with the republics. The bad news is that these glowing points are far more dangerous than anything we've seen so far. Those are fairies, Your Highness. Fairies? As in pixies? Are you alright, Mr. Storm? I mean, even if that's true, then how dangerous can they be? Look at them, they must be smaller than a palm of my hand. But, of course, there are no such things as fairies, so how about we stop this weird conversation, get back to our men and kick out those green ones out from our doorstep? They must have been drawn here by this rupture, or maybe they have been created by it. Your Highness, what do you... Your Highness, wait! Ah, stars take this dumb kid, he's going to get himself killed, and by fairies no less. Damn it, I can't let him die in such a pathetic way. The rest of the guild would kill me with laughter if I did. And so it was that Prince Arius Erigen, heir of a kingdom that no longer existed, charged forth towards his very first battle in his new realm. His mentor could only sigh with resignation and follow, hoping that this initial encounter won't also be a final one. Yet, as luck would have it, there was little reason to worry, for young Princeling's new army quickly followed their new commander as well, just as curious as him about the mysterious well of swirling energy that lied in front of them. More importantly, though, they were determined to keep Arius alive for a bit more pragmatic reasons than just curiosity. After all, the prince was the only possible employer so far from home, and the only guarantee that their pay would arrive on time, something that Governor Gerstein often had problems with. And so, mere moments after Arius and his bodyguards rushed towards bizarre floating rocks, the rest of the army followed, hoping that this entire trip would not prove to be a tragic mistake for everyone involved. As they came closer to the place, though, they were welcomed by an odd, high-pitched shriek that pierced the air and made everyone, from trained veterans of the Royal Guard to volunteer militiamen from Muzaka, anxious and itchy. Moments later, a band of goblins emerged from amongst the rocks, small, hooded figures carrying scepters that identified them as those capable of using magic. But despite goblin vocal abilities, that can only be compared to scratching one's nails across blackboard, they were not the source of the ear-piercing scream. That, to surprise of everyone in Arius's force, emanated from a different place, a cloud of small, flying, glowing creatures only slightly larger than a human hand that swarmed from their hiding places high in the circle of rocks and now buzzed towards incoming soldiers like a cloud of glowing hornets. That, fortunately, was enough to convince Arius to stop dead in his tracks and allowed Mr. Storm and his retinues, as well as a company of cavalrymen, to catch up to the prince and convince him that running off on his own could have meant his death there and then. For these creatures, despite their small size, were clearly not happy to make new acquaintances, and would no doubt fight with all their might to remove human intruders from their home. An argument commenced between the prince and his teacher about what they should do, but Mr. Storm actually agreed with Arius. He too wanted to clear this place from potentially dangerous creatures. He only wanted to do so in a slightly more organized manner than just rushing headfirst into something that could potentially be dangerous. And it indeed was dangerous, as Prince's men quickly learned. For the goblins that swarmed from amongst the rocks soon got close enough to unleash a barrage of deadly poisonous bolts that made even the hardened veterans of the Wolven Guard sway on their feet and throw up their breakfast in debilitating, and sometimes even fatal, fits of nausea. But the true surprise was delivered by the miniature floating fairies, who, after flying forward a bit, suddenly vanished in a flash of light and reappeared right in the middle of Arius's musket line. The men, surprised beyond words by this unexpected attack, could only swing their weapons as improvised clubs, but as they did so, the small pixies unleashed their own surprise, a flurry of shocking discharges, not so different from ones Mr. Storm was using to take care of his own enemies. Though not as deadly as good old-fashioned sword to the face, these attacks were nonetheless extremely dangerous, for every time one of them connected with its target, said target had to endure a tremendous static shock that made moving almost an impossible task. The only good news was that the creatures themselves were, due to their minuscule size, rather weak and easy to dispatch, at least as long as you could land a hit on them without dropping your weapon from fingers you could no longer control. Arius himself realized that very soon when another group of these creatures flashed in between his own unit and engaged the prince in a fierce, chaotic combat. Arius's men knew what they were doing, and His Highness himself was trained to fight, but after landing his very first blow that knocked a small body to the ground with a disgusting crack of tiny broken bones, his mace fell too, as armor transferred the static energy from the now dead creature into Prince's body, paralyzing it in a fit of convulsion. The same thing happened to Spearguts on the other side of a pile of rocks, but luckily for them, the immobilizing shocks happened only after the majority of the creatures were slain, and together with the gunners, the guards were able to win their engagement. And so did the prince, although in his case it was Mr. Storm who saved his skin. At first, the sorcerer tried to launch his own shocking attack at the creatures, but they just shrugged it off, forcing the mentor to charge in and demonstrate his ability to crack heads using simple, old-fashioned methods. After all, magical staves wielded by Mr. Storm and his students could easily be used as clubs, and were more than enough to smash their small, floating foes into the ground. And that was pretty much it. The goblins that began the attack were pinned in place by Metzacan swordsmen, and although they managed to inflict some losses amongst the militiamen, they were no match for the cavalry unit that charged into their back and ended the fight in one swift, devastating move. It was over. Prince Erigen's first battle at the edge of the world was a victory, but as he took a look around the battlefield, he realized that even against such seemingly small and insignificant foes, it was not a flawless one. Around 30 soldiers lied dead on the field, mostly swordsmen from Muzaka, who had to endure the brunt of toxic goblin attack, but also some of the gunners, and even a few of Arius's own retainers. Another 40 or so men were wounded, and though most of them would make a full recovery, it meant that in the meantime their companies were no longer fully capable of fighting. But there was a silver lining, for as soon as the place was secured, Mr. Storm and his magical retinue set off to work to make sense of the spring they just took control of, and when they returned to camp a few hours later, they brought with them something that made Arius and most of his soldiers forget the losses they took. The spring, or mana node as Mr. Storm called it, was apparently a conduit of sorts, in which mysterious energies of the world focused in a small area, which made it possible to harvest them. The energy itself was untamed, but the rocks that made up the place proved to be perfect means of storing it, and using some tricks he learned during his own training, Mr. Storm was capable of extracting some of them and could now use them in a multitude of ways. The larger, more polished crystals could be used to store large amounts of raw energy and used to, for instance, power machinery in factories, farms and mines. The smaller ones, however, could be emptied of their residual power and filled in with something else, namely Mr. Storm's own power. Then, they could be attached to weapons and discharge this energy when it was needed the most, like, for example, when hitting an enemy, which would make the strike not only slightly more powerful, but also capable of delivering a small, focused lightning. Nothing too spectacular, but efficient enough to make a difference when used by masked soldiers. And so, Arius's mentor and his students set off to work overnight, fixing weapons of their comrades with shock-infused surprises. It was a jury rig at first, and the soldiers would now wield swords and spears with glowing rocks tied to them with a bit of string, but no one complained as their effectiveness could not be denied. And in time, Metzacan blacksmiths could surely reforge the weapons in a bit more permanent and stylish fashion. On the next morning, however, the army packed up the camp and set off for Muzaka again, to deliver both news about their victory and, to balance such good news, bodies of their fallen comrades, so that they could be burned on funeral pyres that would free their souls and send them to the stars. But funerals and magical weapons were not the only concerns for the prince who, after taking part in a silent, solemn ceremony, realized that if he wanted to actually make any headway in the wild, untamed lands outside of Muzaka, he would need all the forces he could muster. That meant that handgunners left behind to guard Metzacan streets would have to be recalled, and new, additional forces gathered to make sure that Arius's efforts to restore order to the colony would not end due to the lack of able-bodied soldiers. But Governor Gerstein protested yet again, and not without a valid reason. The city was broken free from its stupor after the prince arrived, and some of the refugees and colonists vacated the streets to establish new settlements and farmlands outside of the walls, but Muzaka still couldn't remain completely unprotected, not only from outside but also inside threats. Sending forces out into the fields to ensure victories over renegades was important, but so was civil protection. But fortunately, Arius had just the idea in mind to resolve the issue. Back home, his father used to have some serious problems with criminal organizations that used chaos after Archmage's rebellion to take control over several districts in the capital city, and the regular army simply wasn't able to deal with them. As soon as forces arrived to deal with one of many gangs, the bandits simply vanished in the alleyways. The city, after all, was not a place where military doctrine applied. A murderer could turn corner, throw his weapon over some wall, put hands in his pockets and look like a regular citizen, which was something that even King Seron's elite forces simply couldn't deal with. The solution, however, proved to be surprisingly easy. If criminals roamed the streets, then the best thing to deal with them would be to organize and arm the willing inhabitants of said streets and form them into law-enforcing units, the so-called civic guard. Sure, many of the people who volunteered for such a service were petty criminals themselves, but once everything was said and done, they were certainly far more preferable than regular mobsters. And finally, even if on some occasions the guards became pretty much just another gang, then at the very least they were an organized one, monitored by the government. So, when Arius proposed to form civic guard companies in Muzaka, he found himself looking at the long lines of volunteers, eager to finally bring some peace to the overcrowded city. So numerous were these volunteers, in fact, that the prince found himself unable to actually organize a proper company right away, as funds and resources needed to be gathered beforehand to get these men armed and trained. Swords, light 100 crossbows, nets to capture fleeing criminals, and, of course, the fanciest, puffiest uniforms the money could buy. Not only to instill pride amongst the guardsmen, but also to reassure the population, who could always easily see where the nearby protector of peace was. Of course, the criminals themselves enjoy these uniforms as well, as they made spotting officers of the law a trivial task, but that was a small price to pay to give the city of Muzaka some semblance of civilized law enforcement that would actually try to arrest, and maybe even try to rehabilitate, any evildoers, instead of just putting them to the sword right on the spot. The results were mixed, as one might expect, but at the very least, they convinced the governor to release his handgunners, so they could join Prince Arius in his future escapades. And said escapades began a month later, when the first civic guard unit was formed and deployed, and took Arius and his army north, where, according to Governor Gerstein, lied 2 mining settlements that stopped sending messages and tax money in the past few years. The prince took his force and marched alongside an overgrown dirt road, but after several days, his group stopped in the middle of the day, distracted by horrific wailing noise coming from a nearby forest. His Majesty tried to send scouts to investigate, but the men were stopped by Mr. Storm, who forbade them, and the prince as well, to even think about approaching the source of the noise. He refused to answer any further questions or to clarify what got him so scared, but he simply replied that he will return here with Arius very soon, after they prepare accordingly for what awaited them there. As for what such preparations would entail, the prince and his men could only guess, but in the end they gave an odd, screaming patch of forest a wide berth and continued on their journey. And finally, at the end of the week, they spotted a bit of civilization. A small village huddled next to an open mine sat on the plains, at the edge of a dark forest. and it quickly became obvious just why exactly the place no longer sent any messages or material back to Muzaka. There was no one there, or at the very least no one friendly. The whole place was overrun by kobolds and their barghest hounds, and the original inhabitants were nowhere to be found. The odd part was that the place was clearly well stocked with weapons, as the kobolds ran around wielding heavy crossbows that must have been bought from the continent, since these small creatures are not really able to manufacture weapons of such complexity by themselves. Sadly, no answers could be found just by looking at the mining camp from afar, but since the day was already late, and the army tired after the long march, the prince and his scouts decided to return to the main force, set up camp and rest before approaching any closer. Their plan, however, was changed in the morning, when a group of scouts galloped into the camp, exhausted and bearing some very disturbing news. A large gang of brigands and thieves that terrorized outlying settlements for a past decade was spotted encamped in a small valley to the north, clearly unaware that Metzacan forces were so numerous and so close. This meant little to the arrivals from the continent, but to locals, this gang of elves, halflings and orcs was a menace that could not be ignored, and so local commanders insisted to take the army north and deal with the bandits while they were in the open. The prince did not argue. By helping his soldiers, he would earn their trust and loyalty, and so he took his cavalry squadron and circled around the rocky valley where the gang was encamped, waiting for Mr. Storm to bring the rest of their forces into a position to attack, hoping to catch the brigands in a pincer, from which they could not run away. Many things could have gone wrong with this plan, but the gang was clearly completely surprised by the sudden arrival of a military force of a size that was never seen on this island before, and when Mr. Storm's adjutant sounded the horn that began the attack, the bandits simply charged at approaching soldiers without even a semblance of a plan. The orcs rushed in first, thanks to their long legs, and opened up with their favorite tactic of throwing javelins at anyone who came too close, in this case, Mr. Storm and his wizards. But the bandits launched their attack too soon, and most of their javelins fell short, with only a few reaching their targets and causing only minor wounds. In response, the magicians cantered forward a bit and launched an attack of their own, but just like their opponents, they could only throw their lightning bolts in the general direction of the orc brigands, who took cover amongst the rocks that dotted the area. Still, even though this attack was not exactly the most deadly one, it still took the greenskins by surprise, as this clearly was the first time when their raid was met with an entire squadron of angry sorcerers. With that covering fire in place, the rest of the army marched forward, moving in cautiously, as they knew that their foes were all armed with ranged weapons that could prove deadly if Arius's men were caught unawares. The guardsmen, of course, took point, holding their shields high, confident in knowledge that their armor would no doubt be enough for any attacks to bounce off without issues. And just behind them, the arquebusiers followed, using the guards as living shields and looking for an opening to launch a deadly volley. On the left flank, second group of handgunners moved in as well, and even reached a position from where they could attack the orcs, but their officer told them to hold fire until the last moment. Their guns might have been deadly, but they certainly took a while to reload, and so it was best to launch an attack when it was sure to cause maximum damage, especially since wolves skulk among the rocks as well, looking for an opening to rush in with their axes and quench their lust for blood. All that commotion meant that the bandits focused all their attention on the front and completely failed to spot Arius and his horsemen approaching from their side, circling in for a hammer and anvil rear attack. But that did not mean that the fight was already over. Sensing that they would have to pull all their stops to survive this fight, the elves charged by their orc comrades and launched dozens of glass bottles at the spear guards who, expecting it to be some form of grenades, raised their shields and prepared for the worst. The bottles then smashed into their targets and seemingly nothing happened, until the moment when one of the guards lowered his shield, which then melted in his hands and oozed to the ground. The bottles were filled with corrosive alchemical solution that turned weapons and armor into useless jelly, but fortunately had almost no effect on the human body, and so the guards could simply back off and begin a desperate process of scraping the corrosive goo from their armaments with everything they could find. The halflings then creeped in, anxious and uncomfortable due to being seen, and, using rocks as cover, launched a series of poison darts at the Wolven Guard, dropping several of the axemen on the spot and forcing others to fall to the ground in convulsions. The orcs then used this commotion to flank left and threw another volley at the javelins at the wolves who, already weakened by the halflings, now found themselves completely stuck as the javelins were followed by a brutal, swift attack of the elves. If not for their unshakable morale and fierce combat skills, the axemen would have been dead, and in fact, almost half of their number fell in this one quick engagement. But despite all that, they managed to hold on, and that was enough. For their sacrifice allowed the rest of the army to get into position and deliver the killing blow. First, Arius and his horsemen rushed in behind the unsuspecting orcs and fired a close-range volley with their muskets, leaving only a handful of terrified survivors who turned to flee, but were finished off by another company of gunners. Then, the arquebusiers on the right flank crept in closer towards the halflings, formed a line, and launched a devastating hail of bullets into the flank of small, bare-footed brigands that ripped their small bodies apart limb from limb and threw them backwards, right into approaching cavalrymen, who did not even have to use their weapons and simply trampled their foes into the ground. Seeing that, the elves that tried to fight the Wolven Guard realized that in matter of mere minutes they were left without any friends and tried to surrender, but it's difficult to raise your hands when a crazed madman with two-handed axe has just chopped them off. And so, before the next minute of the battle was over, the last of the bandits in the field was taken out, and the remaining wolves let out a deafening howl that was soon picked up by the locals, happy to have finally dealt with the brigands who were a thorn in their side for so long. What's more, the remaining few brigands, terrified by the display of power they have just witnessed, proved to be extremely cooperative and eagerly explained to Arius and his men how to reach their hideout which, while not exactly full of valuables, was stocked from top to bottom with weapons that could be used to arm more militiamen. It would take a while to get said weapons back to the city, but the prince was more than willing to have some more fighting men on his side. What's more, taking down the gang clearly caused some ripples around in the area, because when Prince's men resumed their operations, they found that two nearby settlements were completely devoid of any life. The kobolds and whoever was in the other one must have noticed Arius' victory over the gang and left the area as quickly as they could. So quick, in fact, that they even left behind some valuables that could be transported back to Muzaka and used to train more militiamen and soldiers. In fact, a lot of the weapons found in the gang's hideout were already put to use, and a company of pikemen followed by two companies of archers were ready to join expeditions outside of the city. There was, however, an issue, one that forced Arius and Mr. Storm to slightly reorganize their band of misfits. The magical weapons created by Prince's mentor were powerful, but they needed frequent recharging, which meant that soldiers that used them had to keep close to Mr. Storm at all times. Additionally, the enchantment did not work on ranged weapons, or maybe rather it did, but only on the weapons themselves, not the projectiles they launched, as that would require a power-infused stone to be attached to every arrow and musket round, which was pretty much impossible. And as good as electrifying musket sounds, it's not really an efficient nor effective weapon, and so from that moment, the command of the army was split in two. Arius took command of the ranged troops, his archers and his gunners, while Mr. Storm took control of the vanguard, to ensure he would always be close to his men if their weapons needed recharging. Of course, youngest Erigen was still in charge, but many started to wonder just how much actual power did the prince actually held, and whether or not he was just a puppet whose strings were pulled by his mentor. Still, those rumors were not really of any concern to Arius and Mr. Storm, who now marched south after receiving a message from Governor Gerstein. Apparently, a large caravan of settlers departed southwest from Muzaka, but shortly after leaving the civilized area, it was ambushed by some unknown attackers. Only a handful of riders survived, but the prince has, nonetheless, decided to investigate, not only to avenge his people, but also to, hopefully, recover resources from this caravan. And if some of the settlers were still alive, that would be an added bonus, but no one really dared to hope for such a miracle. And yet, a miracle did happen, if we define miracle as something extremely unlikely. For after a few days of marching to the south, the prince and his teacher had a chance encounter with someone from Mr. Storm's past, someone who he hoped to never see again. Just between you and me, Mr. Storm, I think this place is nothing short of a madhouse. I know the governor said that this island is not exactly filled with law-abiding citizens, but these past few months were completely insane. No matter where we go, we find only brigands or thieves or rebels, and now that we finally managed to bring some order, the first news we receive is that one of our caravans vanished without a trace. I feel like the entire crime underworld from back home packed up and moved here. You are not that far off, Your Highness. Indeed, quite a lot of crime organizations moved here after continental law enforcement became better organized, but as much as it would be easier, we can't categorize all these people out there as outlaws. As the governor said, most of them are just failed colonists who were forced to do whatever they had to survive. They might have technically lived inside our colonial sphere of influence, but in truth the kingdom did almost nothing for them. And now we show up, carrying a banner of a state that technically no longer exists, and we want them to hand over their valuables as taxes, so no wonder they would rather try and fight us than give up on everything they managed to achieve up to now. When you put it like that, it's easy to understand why so many people gave me those sideways glances back in Muzaka. We're probably just another gang to them, only slightly better uniformed. But it doesn't matter, they may not like it, but we'll get this place organized. And despite everything, I have to say it's refreshing to take part in a cleanup operation like that. Not pleasant, of course, fighting never is, but it's always better to fight enemies who openly want to harm you, rather than traitors and assassins hiding within your own home. I don't think we should discount the possibility of knife in the dark yet, Your Highness. Not with all the ripples we've... Wait, Arius, get down! Look there, movement in the trees. I see it. Let me just get my spyglass. Yes, there they are. I can see some carts scattered around, must be our missing caravan, and I see some figures moving around them, dwarfs probably, judging by their stature. Let me see. Yes, they look... Oh hell, now this is not a sight I thought I would see ever again. Your Highness, those are not dwarves, at least not anymore. Those are frostlings. I forgot you have never seen them before. Frostlings? But I thought my father got rid of them after he killed the Archmage. Back home, yes. He led the Coalition army during the rebellion, but he only cleared the continent of them back then. We knew some patches of terrain were affected outside of the epicenter, even in the Empire, and that's 3,000 kilometers across the ocean, so it's possible these islands got affected as well. Yeah, I remember. We had this inexplicable patch of ever-present snow in the castle gardens. Father used it to store his drinks there, and there was this bar in the Iron District that always served ice-cold beer because their larder got hit as well. But never mind that. This is an important discovery right there, Mr. Storm. With the Archmage gone, maybe we could somehow talk to them. From what I've heard, no one ever really tried to understand them. Not for the lack of trying. Unfortunately, you can't really talk to them. Well, you can, but you can only expect a harpoon to the face for your troubles. They're not really interested in coexistence and cooperation. They may look similar to us, but don't let their looks fool you. Their minds are as alien as those of deep-sea creatures. But I thought they're just regular people who were hit by the spell. Sure, they fought against us back during the rebellion, but that was a long time ago. Surely they would want to get their old lives back, don't you think? Sadly, no. See, when the Archmage went insane, he casted this spell that engulfed huge tracts of land in permafrost. Why would he do that, we will probably never know, but the side effect was that all the people who lived in affected areas turned into those things you can see skittering between the trees. At first, we thought that they were some kind of mindless undead or victims of mass possession, but after first few encounters we realized they're civilized and sentient, but their personalities and their bodies were completely different. And, in fact, I believe their psychological changes are the direct result of physical ones, because frostlings operate on a completely different set of rules. For example, we confirmed that they cannot breed. The ones that are alive today are the very same people who were affected by the spell. But at the same time they do not age, at least not while they remain in temperatures below zero, which means that these ones here are either foolish, suicidal, or they have a very good reason to be here, or they have a place they can freeze themselves close by. Still, we on the other hand can't really survive for long in freezing temperatures, so there's really no way for us to live together. They know this, and we know this, and there's really not much we can do about it at this point, other than to put them out of their misery. As I said, they may look like people they were before, but after the spell hit them, they no longer seem to remember their previous lives. They're different, alien race with different culture and even different language. And good eyes as it seems. I think they spotted us. A group of them just detached from their main formation and is running over here. They're shouting something. Yeah, Blöte Gehörde. It's their war cry. I believe it means kill the warmbloods or eviscerate. We'll cover the linguistics later when they're not trying to kill us. Now run! It is one thing to see a warband of frostlings, far away from their unnaturally freezing habitats, charging at you from amongst the trees, but it is a completely different, and arguably much worse thing, to see a column of man-sized penguins marching in formation right behind them like some grotesque caricature of an actual army. And yet, it was exactly that sight that Arius and his men saw in the warm plain southwest of Muzaka. Some of the soldiers just stood there, stunned, especially young natives from the island who never encountered frostlings before, but a few sharp orders from their commanders broke this spell. No matter how outlandish these foes were, they were still responsible for killing a bunch of colonists and stealing a ton of supplies, and now they had to be put to sword to pay for it. At this point though, Arius's army grew almost twice from the size it was at the start of their adventures, and so it was obvious that no matter how hard these frozen dwarfs fought, their defeat was inevitable, though they still could take many of Prince's men down with them, and so the army advanced with caution. His Highness and his retinues rode on ahead of the main force to take a closer look at their foes, to better understand what they were up against, and through their spyglasses they noticed that their enemies wielded their signature weapons, odd, curved harpoons that glowed with cold light. For the frostlings are not only frozen themselves, they can also produce weapons that retain their frigid temperatures even in the most scorching heat. Fortunately, it also means that they require frequent maintenance, so the warmer the area is, the easier the fight against the frostlings will be, and if you can bring actual fire to bear against them, they will melt like the ice they rose up from. But the javelin men were not the only threat. The aforementioned man-sized penguins waddled on with surprising speed, and soon passed their smaller comrades, approaching Mr. Storm's line in a cacophony of weird, wet noises and disgusting smell of rotten fish. But the real problem, as Arius' scout team noticed, was the group in the center. Wielding heavy hammers, these ice-cold warriors were a deadly threat to both pikemen and shield walls, as they could simply smash through their opponent's guard and overwhelm them with wild, shattering strikes. Numerical advantage was still on colonial side though, and so Metzacan forces marched forward, forming a line and readying themselves to receive a charge, while on the right flank, Arius' skirmishers crept through the undergrowth to prepare an ambush for approaching javelin men. Mr. Storm and his crew, however, managed to get close enough to deliver the first strike in this fight, and launched a series of deadly thunderbolts at the waddling penguins, dropping a good half of them before they could even get into combat. The frostlings, however, were not about to just roll over and die. Their hunters reached a good position amongst some heavy vegetation and threw their harpoons at Arius's archers, killing about a dozen men on the spot and pinning over twice that number to the ground, forcing their comrades to drop everything and carefully rescue their fellow soldiers from their predicament. In the center, the hammer-wielding warriors rushed right past the spearguard and charged into sword-armed militiamen, smashing their shields aside and breaking their formation, allowing the penguins to dive right into the middle of the now shattered shield wall and bite the soldiers with their oversized beaks. It would be a comical sight, if not for the fact that some men lost their lives or limbs to these birds, but fortunately, their magic-infused weapons allowed them to retaliate with surprising efficiency, and so the company stood strong, holding the hammerers on one side and slaughtering the penguins on the other one. The birds were after all just that. Birds, and no matter how oversized they were, their soft bodies could not survive relentless sword strikes. Soon, almost entire flock was dead, and only 4 of them managed to get away in a cloud of smoke, mumbling something about tactical retreat to the base. Their comrades, however, were not as lucky. Realizing that their first charge was not as devastating as it should, the hammerers took a step back to look for another opening, but in that very moment they were trampled by a thundering charge of Metzacan cavalrymen, ending the fight on that flank in one swift move. And on the right, the hunters suddenly found themselves under an absolute deluge of arrows coming at them from 2 sides at once, rendering their shields completely useless against such an overwhelming crossfire. Individual arrows were perhaps not as deadly as their harpoons, but the archers could launch them a lot quicker and from a distance that prevented any retaliation. Within a few moments, the last of the frostling hunters was turned into a pincushion, and the battle ended with yet another victory for Arius Erigen. Though it was not really a glorious one. The fight might have been won with little issues, but a quick look at the battlefield and the destroyed caravan quickly revealed that it was pretty much meaningless. The colonists were slaughtered and most of their valuables and supplies stolen. What's more, there were a lot more tracks around the area, all disappearing in the forest to the south, which meant that there were, without a doubt, even more frostlings out there, a grave threat to both travelers and inhabitants of the outlying villages. There was a bit of silver lining though. The caravan was mostly robbed, but for some reason the attackers left several crates of tools behind, probably due to their weight. Together with hammers taken from the fallen warriors, they added up to a surprisingly large collection of heavy-duty tools, which gave some of the soldiers an idea to use them for military purposes. Muzaka had no means of producing truly modern equipment like muskets or cannons, but it could still use its natural resources, in form of sprawling forests, to create more old-fashioned machines of war, like trebuchets or battering rams, and the tools taken from the battlefield could serve as a starting point for an actual siege workshop. And, if they were not used to build deadly devices of destruction, the tools could be used to simply construct other things, which, in overcrowded Muzaka, was more important than one might think. In fact, quite a lot of these supplies were handed over to Governor's people right away, in order to start fixing and improving roads that led towards those 2 mining settlements in the north. Both were now abandoned, and due to long distance between them and safety of Muzaka, not many settlers were willing to resettle them. Mr. Gerstein, however, decided to counter that by sending a group of contractors north, where they would construct a temporary fort that could serve as protection for the colonists. It was, of course, an expensive endeavor, and it would still take months to actually accomplish it, but it was a symbolic day for Muzaka. For the first time in years, the city was safe enough that it could actually start expanding outwards. Arius's arrival might have been welcomed with distrust, but no one could deny that he got the job done, and he was certainly not willing to stop anytime soon. And in fact, after he sent his wounded back to Muzaka, Arius continued his journey, this time to the west, where 2 more mining settlements were located. The first one, however, was an odd one. It was abandoned, but upon closer examination, it turned out that no one was there for good several years, maybe even a decade. Additionally, there were no signs of combat, and colonists' possessions were still there. It was like everyone just suddenly decided to stand up and walk away, leaving all their belongings behind. A mystery to be sure, but Arius was more focused on the fact that the miners left their valuables, as well as an operational mine and a warehouse full of copper ore that could be sent to Muzaka and sold to merchants. So, a successful investigation, although Mr. Storm was not really happy about not knowing what happened to the miners there. Something odd must have occurred, he claimed, but alas, there was no time to continue the investigation, for another settlement to the south proved to be far more problematic than the empty one. It was actually one of the few that Arius knew about, for it was marked on the very shoddy map he received from the governor. Apparently, the place was not inhabited by human colonists, but rented out to a small tribe of Galian orcs. And that piece of information was enough to make Arius and his men shiver. Unlike their imperial brothers and sisters from the north, who were sophisticated, cultured and highly diplomatic people, the orcs from Galian tribes were more unruly, to put it in very mild terms. They were great warriors and exceptional workers, with a proper supervision. Without it, however, their nature, a bizarre mix of both hedonistic and nihilistic tendencies, usually got the better of them and reduced them to gloomy, drunken fools, permanently tweaked out on whatever they could find and smoke or inject. Over the past 3 decades, a number of missionaries were dispatched from the Empire to Galian tribes, and they saw some successes there, turning their unruly brothers and sisters into more civilized beings, but the orcs encountered by Arius and his men have clearly not heard the good news. The mining settlement they inhabited was almost completely ruined, with few remaining buildings turned into stills or drug farms, while green-skinned inhabitants slummed in tents stretched across the mine itself. The prince and his teacher approached them with utmost care, braving the undescribable stench of cheap booze, hoping to convince them to either get back to work or to at least pack up their little drug den and move away. The orcs responded, well, like orcs. First, they just stared blankly. Then, they got into argument with themselves. Then, some of them started talking to their clothes and weapons. A voice raised above the crowd, calling Arius a tyrannical oppressor disjointed from the real world. Next one followed, claiming that a portion of fairy dust could be bought in tent number 7 for mere 10 silvers. A really good deal. Then, another one yelled something about futility of life and meaninglessness of existence. A minute later, Arius found himself in a situation in which a drooling greenskin hugged his leg, mumbling something about being forced to sell drugs to feed his daughter. And then, finally, surprising absolutely no one, a javelin was thrown from the crowd. The prince, still shell-shocked by a long line of drool running along his leg, retaliated with his musket and all hell broke loose in a matter of seconds. The orcs screamed their lungs out in a war cry that demanded Arius to give up all material possessions and embrace communal unity, and then charged forward, forcing the prince and his mentor to run back to the army and prepare for a fight. Fortunately, as was said, this turn of events surprised absolutely no one, and the lines of soldiers were ready to fight as soon as their commanders rode out from the camp, with Arius demanding to get a change of clothes as soon as it was humanly possible. What followed then was a complete and utter chaos. Most of the orcs were actually armed with bows, so Arius and Mr. Storm were only alive thanks to the fact that frayed brains of their green-skinned enemies actually needed a moment to figure out how to shoot again. Once they did though, the volleys they launched turned out to be surprisingly accurate and deadly, especially due to the fact that almost every single arrowhead was a wicked, barbed piece of twisted metal, designed to cause as much pain as possible. For Galian orcs enjoy not only drugs, alcohol and philosophy, they also have a thing for blood, and are willing to go to ridiculous extents to see their foes, or themselves, if there's no alternative, bleed all over the place. Unfortunately, an average orc is usually a bit stronger than a human, even without taking tweaker's strength into account, which meant that the greenskins were able to actually survive for long enough to cause some serious damage to Prince's men, and even killed Arius's horse. But luckily, while the orcs had their drugged-up might on their side, Metzacan forces had numbers and the ability to think straight, which meant that the brawl ended within a few minutes, with most of the orcs being either turned into pincushions by archers and hunt-gunners, or mopped to death by cavalry and spearmen. A handful of enemies were captured, mostly because they could barely stand up to begin with, and sent back to Muzaka under guard, while Prince's men began a long and unpleasant process of dismantling the drug den. After an hour or so though, even Mr. Storm gave up, and they simply set fire to the whole village and got back to the camp to wait out the raging flames. Overall though, the expedition was proving to be quite a successful one, and as the sun set, the camp echoed with sounds of people who were proud of their accomplishments. The prince, however, was not participating in festivities. He had a lot of paperwork to fill, and so he retired to his tent with Mr. Storm to sort out all the necessary documentation. It was a sad reality of leadership. All ledgers had to be in order for the colony to run efficiently. Nothing could make this night exciting or interesting for Arius. Nothing, except for an unexpected visit. So as you can see, Your Highness, despite all these fights we had to endure over the past few weeks, the overall situation in the colony is actually improving at an unexpectedly high rate. Granted, it would be much easier if the port was operational, but unfortunately that storm that hit it before our arrival completely ruined the entire shoreline. Still, some merchant ships from the continent have arrived and managed to get their goods ashore away from the city, which means that we have officially restored trade with home, and I believe we'll only see more traders further down the line, maybe even imperial ones from the north. And, of course, our own actions have finally pushed the masses hidden in Muzaka to go out there and explore, which means that we should see new settlements growing up very soon. And new settlements obviously mean more taxes and goods that can be sold in Muzaka. And finally, as an added bonus, people are finally becoming eager about joining our forces. Our victories were not exactly flawless, true, but they gave all those refugees and exiles on the streets of Muzaka hope that things will finally change here. We should capitalize on this, Your Highness, before this enthusiasm dies down, so if you don't mind, I'll be off to prepare documents we need for the new recruits and reinforcements from the city. I'll give them to you to sign in a moment.
Ah, finally the chaperone is away.
Gah! What the? Who are you and how long have you been standing there?
Long enough to hear your conversation with Sparky. Entire conversation. And let me tell you, after listening to his tirade about trade tariffs, I'm surprised I'm still awake. Though, I have to say, I really need to kill something right now. And as for who I am, well, I could tell you right away, but where's the fun in that? I can tell that you are very happy to see me after all, my prince. Is that a pistol in your pocket or... Oh, it actually is a pistol. I will be taking a step back now, if you don't mind.
That would be best for everyone involved. Now, kindly explain who you are, miss.
Galadea Pireni, originally from Griscom Republic, but my parents moved to these islands when I was 7 to live the colonial dream here. And they did, which means they both died of dysentery about 2 months after arrival. Been living here ever since.
So, you're almost a native then. Good, so that's out of the way. Now tell me, what are you doing here in my tent?
Why, I always dreamed about meeting a handsome prince who would sweep me off my feet, so when I heard that there's a real one around, I couldn't resist the urge to see him for myself. And I have to say, Your Highness, you do cut a real impressive figure. No doubt you have a line of debutantes just waiting to spend some time with such a pretty face. Although continental fashion must have changed quite a bit since I was there as a kid, like those sideburns, for instance.
My facial hair have nothing to do with anything. I had no time to shave them during these past few months.
Ah, but you shouldn't. It's a real statement to wear them like that. It shows the world that you're not a man who cares about petty opinions of other people. I like them.
Why, well, thank you, Wait, no, what the hell are you trying to pull, miss? 2 steps back, hands above your head and speak. What the hell are you doing here? Did Ishizawa send you here to kill me?
But all those serious questions are no fun. Oh, alright, I guess I can humor you, but only because we really shared a moment back there, my prince. First, I have no idea who that Imagawa guy even is. I mean you no harm, and if I did, then wouldn't it be smarter to just take you out when you had no idea I was even here? So you can relax. No, really, you're so tense that you can pull that trigger by mistake. Next, you want to know what I'm doing here? Well, I heard news that you're not only a real treat to look at, but you're also hiring people to get this island sorted out. At first, I thought the governor once again tried to rally some downtrodden fools to send them on some suicide errand into the wilds, but then I spotted your group and followed you to see what the fuss is about. And you really do get results, Sideburns. Been a while since someone competent was in charge here. So, after you dealt with your last fight, I waited for a good moment to get into your camp, and here I am, ready to offer my assistance.
And it never occurred to you that you can just walk up to the guards and have them escort you to Quartermaster's tent?
The thought crossed my mind, true, but then again I don't want to be just a line soldier. I'm way too good looking for that. So I thought that the best thing I could do was to make a killer first impression on the bossman himself. You are the bossman here, right? Because, to be honest, when you talked with Sparky, you just nodded along and agreed to everything he said. Wait, have you switched places? Is he the real prince and you're his lackey? I have to say, it certainly would throw potential assassins way off their target.
I can assure you, you are talking to the right person. And Mr. Storm is not a lackey but a trusted friend and a loyal retainer. But we're not talking about him, we're talking about you. You said you want to join my forces. Good. I'm not in position to refuse potential recruits. But you also say you don't want to be a soldier. So what makes you think I'll want to hire you?
Well, I managed to sneak into your tent in the middle of the camp in broad daylight and waited here for at least a few hours without you noticing me. Surely that counts for something.
I see. So you're a spy or a scout?
A bit, true, but mostly I'm like Sparky, only less one-dimensional, and far better looking.
Like Mr. Storm? Wait, does that mean you're also a sorcerer?
Sort of. I know there's a guild back on the continent that keeps them all organized, but I'm not really a part of it, since they don't have offices here. I teach myself, most of the time, using books and scrolls I found lying around. But in the end, yes, I am a magic woman. Now you see why it would be a waste to put me in the line with the grunts?
True enough, Miss Pireni. I have to say, it's a bit unexpected to find someone magically gifted without professional training, but then again, it's clear that this archipelago is not really a place where rules from home apply. Very well then, I only have one question left. Why exactly do you want to work for me?
Why, to be closer to you, my handsome prince. Ah, yes, the gun. Well, to be honest, I have my own goals here, but fortunately they are aligned with yours. Most importantly though, I'm doing it for money. I'm going to need a payment up front to set up a little workshop in Muzaka. Don't worry though, after that I won't really need any more gold. I'll get the rest of what I need from your handiwork.
Alright, and what exactly do you plan to do in that workshop?
Nothing special, just some boring research. I'm going to need 150 gold crowns for the equipment though.
What? I could outfit a small army with that money. Is this some kind of scam on your part?
A scam? My prince, you truly wound me. Yes, so many gold crowns is a lot, but the equipment I need, and the place I want to buy, are not cheap either. And besides, just look into my eyes and tell me, could I lie? Come on, look into them.
I am looking into them, Miss Pireni. They look like eyes. And believe me, if I could spot traitors and enemies just by looking at them, I would not be here today.
Odd. Maybe it's the glasses. Anyway, alright, I suppose I can offer you something else besides my gorgeous self. You remember when I told you about magical books and scrolls lying around? Well, I know where to find more of them. Books, scrolls, and other fancy stuff. Old too. Very old, and I know how to unlock the places where you can find them, but most importantly, I know how to tell which ones are valuable and which ones only look like that, so you can make use of those important ones and sell shiny cheap ones to the collectors to get some gold for that army you want so much.
I see. Very well then, Miss Pireni, I'd say you're hired. Unfortunately, I do not really carry such tremendous amounts of gold with me, so you will have to get back to Muzaka and tell the governor I sent you. Here, show him this document and he will set you up with what you need. And if you are a liar, his men will arrest you.
I assure you, my prince, I wish for nothing else but to serve you. And it's even better that I have to get back, means I'll be able to get to work sooner. Now, I assume you and your lads outside are going to be heading back as well, so when you're back in Muzaka, come to Sunflower Street. Look for the crossing. I'll show you that little place of mine.
We'll see about that. We'll see about what, Your Highness?
Ah, Mr. Storm, you're back. I was just concluding business with Miss Pireni over here.
Who? Your Highness, are you feeling alright? There's no one here. You should probably get some sleep.
But, no, you know what, Mr. Storm, I think you're right. I'll get some sleep soon.
For now, though, let's see those papers you prepared. There's still a lot of work to be done.